May 1945. The smoke clears across a devastated Europe. Hitler is dead. The Third Reich has fallen. But what about those who stood beside the architects of genocide? The wives who shared their beds, the children who bore their names, the families of the most notorious war criminals in history. Today, we uncover the hidden aftermath of those directly connected to evil. Not the familiar stories of the Nazi leaders themselves, but the complicated, disturbing, and sometimes shocking fates of their families. What happens when your father is responsible for the deaths of millions? How do you live with a legacy of absolute evil? These seemingly ordinary family albums hide extraordinary stories of denial, escape, reinvention, and in rare cases, redemption. Some families stayed loyal to the bitter end. Others denounced their infamous relatives. Many simply disappeared. This is the story of what happened to the Nazi families after World War II. Heinrich Himmler. The name alone evokes the darkest chapters of the Holocaust. As Reichsfuhrer of the SS and architect of the final solution, Himmler orchestrated the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. But behind this monster was something utterly ordinary: a family. Margaret Himmler met her future husband in 1927. The nurse and devoted Nazi Party member was 7 years older than Heinrich, and their relationship flourished over a shared commitment to Nazi ideology. They married, and in 1929, Margaret gave birth to their only biological child, a daughter named Gudrun. Heinrich Himmler cultivated the image of a devoted family man. Letters exchanged between him and Margarete showed a seemingly normal domestic life, but this facade of normalcy concealed a profound hypocrisy. While preaching about the sanctity of German family values, Himmler maintained a long-time affair with his secretary, Hedwig Pothast, with whom he had 2 children. This double life continued until the final days of the war. As Allied forces closed in, the Himmler family's world collapsed with stunning speed. On May 23, 1945, Heinrich Himmler, attempting to flee in disguise, was captured by British forces. Upon discovery of his identity, he bit down on a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth and died within minutes. The architect of genocide escaped justice through suicide. But what about those he left behind? 15-year-old Gudrun, her mother Margaret, and Himmler's mistress Hedwig with their children were all arrested and placed in various internment camps. What followed reveals the complex ways Nazi families dealt with their toxic heritage. Margaret Himmler never recovered from her husband's death and her subsequent imprisonment. Allied interrogations revealed a woman who claimed ignorance of her husband's crimes, despite overwhelming evidence suggesting otherwise. In detention camps, fellow prisoners reported that she maintained her Nazi beliefs and showed no remorse. Her health deteriorated rapidly, and after her release in 1946, she died from malnutrition and heart failure in 1967, still defending her husband's memory. However, it was Gudrun Himmler's story that would prove most disturbing. At 15, Gudrun Himmler had been the apple of her father's eye. Heinrich called her Puppy, meaning little doll, and documented their relationship in his diaries. One particularly chilling entry from 1941 reads that he had a wonderful time with Gudrun at Dachau concentration camp. Following her father's suicide, Gudrun was held in various Allied internment facilities. Witnesses reported that the teenager was devastated by her father's death and refused to accept the evidence of his crimes. This denial would define the rest of her life. Unlike many Nazi descendants who would later distance themselves from their infamous relatives, Gudrun remained fiercely loyal to her father's memory. Upon her release, she dedicated herself to what she called restoring her father's honor. In the 1950s, she joined Stille Hilfe, or Silent Help, an organization that provided support to former SS members, helping them escape prosecution and rebuild their lives. She eventually married Wolf Dieter Berwitz, a journalist who supported far-right causes, and had 2 children. Until her death in 2018 at age 88, Gudrun Himmler, who lived under her married name Berwitz, remained active in neo-Nazi circles. She never acknowledged her father's crimes and continued to idolize him. Unlike other Nazi descendants who have spoken out against their relatives' actions, Gudrun chose lifelong devotion to a murderous legacy. But what about the children from Himmler's secret family? Helga and Nanette Pothast, Himmler's children with his mistress Hedwig, took a dramatically different path. After being released from internment, Hedwig changed their identity and relocated to a small town in southern Germany. She raised the children under extreme secrecy, never telling them the truth about their father. It wasn't until they were adults that they discovered their true parentage. Unlike their half-sister Gudrun, both Helga and Nanette completely rejected their father's ideology. They have consistently maintained their privacy, refusing interviews, and keeping their distance from their father's infamous legacy. This stark contrast between Himmler's children, one embracing and one rejecting their father's past, illustrates the profound question faced by all Nazi descendants. Do you defend, deny, or denounce your bloodline? Coming up, we'll explore the fate of Hitler's own family and their extraordinary pact that would ensure the bloodline of history's most reviled dictator would vanish forever. And later, the shocking story of how one Nazi's son infiltrated Jewish communities for decades while hiding his true identity. Stay with us as we continue to unveil what happened to the Nazi families after World War II. Hermann Göring stood as Hitler's designated successor until the final days of the Third Reich. As Reichsmarschall and commander of the Luftwaffe, Göring amassed enormous wealth through theft and exploitation. His palatial estate, Hall, displayed stolen art masterpieces and treasures looted from across occupied Europe. Behind the scenes of this criminal empire was a family, his second wife Emmy Sonnemann, a famous actress, and their daughter Edda, born in 1938. Göring doted on his daughter, naming a luxury train after her and showering her with stolen gifts. But as the Allied forces closed in, Göring sent Emmy and 5-year-old Edda to the safety of their mountain estate in Berchtesgaden. He surrendered to American forces on May 9, 1945, and was subsequently tried at Nuremberg for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Göring remained defiant throughout his trial. The night before his scheduled execution in October 1946, he cheated the hangman by taking a cyanide capsule that had been smuggled into his cell. Like Himmler, he escaped the final justice of the gallows. But what happened to the family he left behind? Emmy Göring and her daughter were arrested and interrogated by Allied forces. Although Emmy was classified as a lesser offender in the denazification process, the Görings' wealth was confiscated, leaving them financially ruined. Emmy's post-war life reveals the strange blend of denial and selective memory that characterized many Nazi spouses. In interviews and her 1967 memoir, she portrayed herself as a political innocent, claiming ignorance of her husband's crimes while simultaneously defending his character. She described him as a loving husband and father, conveniently separating his domestic persona from his role in mass murder. After her release from Allied custody, Emmy struggled financially, working occasionally as an actress and relying on assistance from former Nazi colleagues. She died in 1973, having never fully acknowledged her husband's criminality. But it's the story of their daughter Edda that reveals the complicated burden carried by the children of Nazi leaders. Edda Göring was only 7 years old when her father committed suicide. Too young to understand the enormity of his crimes, she grew up idealizing the father she barely knew. Unlike Gudrun Himmler, however, Edda did not become active in neo-Nazi movements. Instead, she lived a mostly private life, while occasionally defending her father's memory. In rare interviews, she described growing up under the shadow of the Göring name. "I had nothing to do with the events of that time," she once stated, "but I still pay the price for those 12 years every day." Despite this claim of victimhood, Edda showed limited recognition of her father's victims. In 2015, at age 76, she made headlines when she petitioned a Bavarian parliament committee to return some of her father's confiscated art collection. The request was unanimously rejected. Edda never married or had children, working instead as a medical laboratory assistant. She died in 2018 at the age of 80, one of the last surviving children of a major Nazi leader. The Göring legacy, however, faces a different reckoning through Hermann's great-niece, Bettina Göring. Born long after the war, Bettina represents a different approach to Nazi family heritage. Unlike Edda, she has publicly denounced her great-uncle's actions and even took the dramatic step of voluntarily undergoing sterilization to ensure the Göring bloodline ends with her generation. "I had my tubes tied at the age of 30 because I feared I would create another monster," she explained in a 2009 documentary. "I look like him, for God's sake." Her radical decision highlights the profound psychological burden carried by some Nazi descendants, a sense of inherited guilt so powerful it influenced reproductive choices. The Göring family's journey from power to disgrace mirrors that of many Nazi families. But some Nazi descendants took much darker paths. Rudolf Hus served as the longest-standing commandant of Auschwitz concentration camp. Under his efficient management, more than 1 million people, primarily Jews, were systematically murdered. Hus was captured after the war, testified at Nuremberg, and was subsequently hanged in 1947 at the site of his crimes. But hidden beneath his notorious story is the disturbing journey of his eldest son, Hans-Jurgen Hus. Hans-Jurgen spent his formative years living with his family in a comfortable villa just outside the walls of Auschwitz. The Hus children rode bicycles, played games, and enjoyed an idyllic childhood while mere yards away, thousands were being murdered daily. Hans-Jurgen later recalled hearing screams and seeing the crematorium chimneys from his bedroom window. After the war, the teenage Hans-Jurgen and his siblings faced the collapse of their privileged world. Their father was executed, their mother imprisoned, and the family name became synonymous with mechanized murder. What followed reveals one of the most disturbing cases of identity concealment among Nazi descendants. After briefly working in Germany, Hans-Jurgen realized his surname made normal life impossible. He obtained false identity papers and, in a twist of profound irony, moved to Israel in the 1950s. There, he concealed his true identity and worked on a ship transporting Holocaust survivors to their new homeland. The son of the Auschwitz commandant was now serving meals to his father's victims. For months, he lived and worked alongside people who, had they known his identity, would have likely killed him on the spot. Hans-Jurgen eventually settled in Paris, still using a false identity. He married, had children, and worked various jobs, including at an international Jewish organization, all while maintaining his elaborate deception. It wasn't until the 1980s that Hans-Jurgen's true identity was discovered by Nazi hunters. Rather than face exposure, he finally acknowledged his past and gave several interviews about his experience as the son of Rudolf Hus. Unlike Jurgen Himmler, Hans-Jurgen did not defend his father. He acknowledged Rudolf Hus's crimes while maintaining he knew nothing of the extent of the atrocities during his childhood. Critics have questioned this claim, pointing out that the evidence of mass murder was visible and audible from the family home. Hans-Jurgen's story raises profound questions about complicity, denial, and the lengths to which Nazi descendants went to escape their toxic heritage. His decades-long deception, particularly his infiltration of Jewish communities, represents a disturbing second violation against Holocaust victims, this time through deception rather than violence. Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect and later Minister of Armaments, cultivated an image as the good Nazi. At Nuremberg, he uniquely acknowledged collective responsibility while denying personal knowledge of the Holocaust. This calculated strategy likely saved him from the gallows. Instead, he received a 20-year prison sentence. During his imprisonment, Speer wrote his memoirs, portraying himself as a technocrat seduced by power rather than ideology. This narrative of limited culpability, though later thoroughly debunked by historians, influenced how his 6 children would understand their father. Unlike many Nazi officials who kept their families away from the inner circle, Speer integrated his children into Nazi society. They attended Hitler's birthday celebrations and received gifts from the Führer. The Speer children were raised in tremendous privilege, living in a mansion acquired from a Jewish family who had fled Germany. After Speer's imprisonment and the family's fall from grace, his wife Margaret maintained the household while raising their 6 children on extremely limited means. When Speer was released in 1966, he returned to a family fractured by his past. His children's responses to their father's notoriety varied dramatically, illustrating the range of ways Nazi descendants have coped with their inheritance. Albert Speer Jr. became a prominent architect like his father, but consciously worked on environmental and sustainable projects as if to counterbalance his father's grandiose Nazi designs. When questioned about his name, he would acknowledge his father's crimes while maintaining personal distance. More outspoken was his sister Hilde Schramm, who took a directly confrontational approach to her father's legacy. She became active in left-wing politics, established foundations to support Jewish causes, and publicly questioned her father's claimed ignorance of the Holocaust. In a remarkable act of restitution, Hilde used an inheritance from her father to establish the Return Foundation, which returns money earned from Nazi-looted properties to Jewish cultural initiatives. "It's not about guilt," she explained in an interview. "It's about responsibility for the future." The Spear children demonstrate the diverse ways Nazi descendants have confronted their family histories, from quiet acknowledgement to active reparation. Their various approaches highlight the fundamental choice faced by all children of perpetrators. Do you attempt to escape your family history, deny it, or actively work to address its consequences? Unlike Albert Speer, who sought to distance himself publicly while preserving his legacy, some Nazi families took far more drastic steps. We'll look at how Hitler's remaining relatives made a quiet but final decision to end their bloodline, and how one granddaughter of a high-ranking Nazi uncovered a devastating secret that reshaped her identity and led her toward an unexpected path of atonement. Adolf Hitler famously had no children of his own. He married his longtime companion Eva Braun in the Führer bunker hours before their suicide on April 30th, 1945. But Hitler did have extended family, nephews, nieces, and distant cousins who carried his bloodline. What happened to the Hitler family after the war reveals perhaps the most extraordinary response of any Nazi relatives. Hitler had a half-brother, Alois Hitler Jr., who had a son named William Patrick Hitler. In an ironic twist, William actually fought for the United States during World War II after emigrating to America in 1939. Following the war, William changed his last name to Stuart Houston and established a quiet life on Long Island, New York. William had 4 sons, none of whom had children of their own. This lack of offspring has fueled speculation about a possible pact among Hitler's relatives to end the bloodline. While no family member has explicitly confirmed such an agreement, the pattern is striking. Hitler's American nephews all remained childless. Of greater historical certainty is the story of Hitler's German relatives. Several of Hitler's nephews and cousins who remained in Germany after the war made a documented pact to never reproduce, effectively ensuring the Hitler name would die with them. The last remnants of the Hitler family have lived in obscurity, changing their names and avoiding public attention. The last known male descendant with the Hitler surname is believed to have died in 1989. Any remaining blood relatives live under different names and maintain strict privacy. This collective decision by Hitler's extended family represents perhaps the most extreme response to Nazi heritage, the deliberate extinction of a bloodline. It stands in stark contrast to families like the Himmlers, where Gudrun proudly carried forward her father's ideological torch. The Hitler family's choice raises profound questions about generational responsibility. Is evil inheritable? Does blood connection to a genocidal dictator create an obligation to ensure that bloodline ends? These questions have no simple answers, but the Hitler family's apparent decision suggests they felt the weight of those questions acutely. While many Nazi descendants have struggled with their family legacy, few have demonstrated the courage shown by Rainer Hus, grandson of Rudolf Hus, and Nicholas Frank, son of Hans Frank, Hitler's governor-general of occupied Poland. Hans Frank was directly responsible for the murder of millions of Polish Jews and was executed after the Nuremberg trials. His son Nicholas, born in 1939, has taken a radically different approach to his father's legacy than many Nazi descendants. Rather than maintain silence or offer qualified defenses, Nicholas Frank has spent decades publicly denouncing his father in the strongest possible terms. He has written books with titles that translate to The Father, A Settling of Accounts, and My German Mother, both scathing indictments of his parents. In public appearances, Nicholas speaks of his father with undisguised contempt. He carries his father's execution order with him and reads it aloud to audiences. When asked about his motivation, he explains that he fears Germany could forget its past, a concern that drives him to continue his public testimony well into his 80s. Nicholas Frank's lifelong campaign against his father's memory represents a radically different approach to Nazi heritage than that chosen by Gudrun Himmler, or even the more moderate paths taken by families like the Speers. He chose complete repudiation and has made confronting his father's crimes his life's work. Similarly, Rainer Hus, grandson of Auschwitz Commandant Rudolf Hus, has embarked on a personal journey of confrontation and education. Born long after his grandfather's execution, Rainer grew up with a sanitized family narrative that portrayed Rudolf Hus as a simple soldier. It wasn't until adulthood that Rainer discovered the full truth. His response was to educate himself about his grandfather's crimes, and then use his family name to educate others. Rainer has visited Auschwitz multiple times, met with survivors, and spoken out against neo-Nazism. In a particularly poignant act, He was symbolically adopted by an Auschwitz survivor, Eva Moses Kor, who saw in him the possibility of reconciliation. "I am not guilty for the crimes of my grandfather," Rainer has stated, "but I bear responsibility for keeping the memory alive." This sense of inherited responsibility, rather than inherited guilt, characterizes those Nazi descendants who have chosen to acknowledge rather than deny their family histories. While the families of Hitler, Himmler, and Göring faced very public scrutiny, thousands of lesser-known Nazi officials and collaborators simply disappeared into post-war society. Many changed their names, relocated to different regions, and created entirely new identities. Some fled to South America, the Middle East, or other regions with sympathetic regimes. Others remained in Germany, quietly reintegrating into society during the economic rebuilding of the 1950s. Their children often grew up completely unaware of their parents' involvement in the Third Reich. These hidden legacies created delayed trauma when the truth eventually emerged. In recent decades, as historical records have become more accessible, many Germans have discovered Nazi connections in their family trees that their parents or grandparents concealed. These discoveries have triggered individual identity crises that mirror Germany's larger national reckoning with its past. Jennifer Tege's story encapsulates this phenomenon. In 2008, a German-Nigerian woman accidentally discovered through a library book that her grandfather was Amon Goeth, the notoriously sadistic commandant of Płaszów concentration camp, depicted in Schindler's List. Tege, who had been adopted as a child and had limited contact with her biological family, had no idea of her connection to one of the Holocaust's most brutal killers. More shockingly, she discovered that her mother had known, but kept this information from her. The revelation shattered Tege's sense of identity and triggered a profound personal crisis. She had previously lived in Israel and had close Jewish friends, relationships she now questioned in light of her newly discovered heritage. After years of psychological struggle, Tege wrote a memoir titled "My Grandfather Would Have Shot Me," in which she recounts her journey toward integrating this terrible knowledge into her identity. Tege's experience highlights the ongoing impact of Nazi legacies across generations. Even descendants who had no personal contact with Nazi relatives must confront questions of inherited responsibility. The stories of Nazi families after World War II reveal the long shadow cast by genocide. From Gudrun Himmler's lifelong devotion to her father's memory, to the Hitler family's apparent decision to end their bloodline, these responses demonstrate the different ways humans cope with connection to profound evil. Some, like Niklas Frank and Heinrich Hus, chose acknowledgement and education. Others, like Jurgen Hus, attempted escape through deception. Still others, like Etta Göring, maintained ambiguous relationships with their infamous parents. These varied responses reveal something important about historical accountability. While we cannot choose our ancestors, we can choose how we respond to their actions. Nazi descendants faced an extreme version of a universal human question. What responsibility do we bear for the sins of our forebears? Germany, as a nation, has largely chosen the path of acknowledgement and memorialization. Its capital, Berlin, features prominent Holocaust memorials, and German schoolchildren learn extensively about Nazi crimes. This national approach to historical memory stands in marked contrast to nations that minimize or deny historical atrocities. But even as Germany has institutionalized remembrance, individual Nazi families demonstrate that confronting the past remains deeply personal. Each descendant must decide whether to deny, defend, or denounce their family history. These stories matter not just as historical curiosities, but as lessons in how societies and individuals recover from moral catastrophe. They remind us that the consequences of genocide extend far beyond the immediate victims and perpetrators, creating generational trauma that touches even those born long after the events themselves. The fates of Nazi families also challenge us to consider our own relationship with history. While few of us are directly connected to events as notorious as the Holocaust, all of us inherit historical legacies that include both achievement and wrongdoing. How we acknowledge those legacies, whether through denial, defensiveness, or honest confrontation, shapes not just our understanding of the past, but our capacity to build a more just future.